I'll leave it to you to
Okay.
choose, but we'd love to hear from folks who have questions for Dr. Schrader.
So in the course of your research, did you ever find any overlap or intersection between police training initiatives like what you've discussed so far and military training initiatives for other countries like the School of the Americas?
Yes. So, I strategically left out the place to talk about this in what I've said so far, so I could talk about it. So, before the International Police Academy was opened in Washington, D.C., for a few years, the Office of Public Safety had an academy in the Panama Canal Zone. The Panama Canal Zone is where the School of the Americas was also based. It was not called the School of the Americas at the time, and now it's also still not. It has another name subsequent to that. But they were in basically the same vicinity on military bases. And there was a fair amount of kind of cross-fertilization between the Inter-American Police Academy. It was Latin America only. That's another reason why they opened the International Police Academy in D.C., so that it could receive officers from Asia and Africa, in addition to Latin America. But the Inter-American Police Academy had a fair amount of kind of crossover with the School of the Americas. But this raised a question, which was, or a couple questions. One was, do they have fundamentally different missions? Questions meaning for the bureaucrats who are overseeing all this. Do they have fundamentally different missions? And if they don't, then why do we need two separate academies? Well, as you can imagine, anybody who is in a kind of bureaucratic agency does not like to be told that their agency is redundant or duplicates another agency's functions, because what that means is that their jobs are potentially on the chopping block. So the police assistants, police training folks said, no, we do something totally different from what the School of the Americas does. Please don't cut our budget. And by the same token, the military also said, we do something totally different from what the police academy does. Now, was that actually true? In some ways, there were significant differences. Although, because police and military in many Latin American countries are fused together and there's not as clear a distinction as there is supposed to be in the United States, there would be some officers who went to both, as trainees. But the School of the Americas, again, was tasked with both training for external aggression and internal security problems. The Police Training Academy was only concerned with internal security problems. The School of the Americas was also more focused on rural areas of Latin America, whereas the Police Academy had a bit more of an urban focus. It also looked at rural areas, but it was a little bit more urban focused. But yeah, they did kind of blur together. The Inter-American Police Academy was closed down, and also the School of the Americas relocated to the mainland United States, in part because of anti-imperialist protests in Panama. In January of 1964, there were the so-called Panama Canal Zone riots, which started over. It was basically over like symbolism, like would the U.S. flag be at higher on the pole than the Panama flag? Like something that seems like a very insignificant, in retrospect, kind of very insignificant, but it touched off an episode of really extreme violence. Some of the police from other countries, from like Guatemala and elsewhere, who were at the International Police Academy, they themselves got attacked because like they were seen as being with American officials who were their trainers. So these protesters, committed acts of vandalism and violence toward the police academy. So they were just like, all right, we got to get this out of the canal zone. We got to move it to another place. We have to make it distinct from the military mission, or else they'll cut our budget. But nevertheless, there were operational connections, sometimes personnel connections, and certainly the overall mission of controlling communist subversion in Latin America. That mission was the same.
So you mentioned that this continues in terms of narcotics enforcement. I'm wondering if you know at all if there's a similar dynamic around like anti-terrorism efforts throughout the world. So I know that that discourse has been globalized, but are like U.S. police officers transferring some of their knowledge in that regard? Do you know?
Yes. I mean, I'm not an expert on the present, but the answer is yes, but also the military is involved to, so in the period I look at, it's mostly cops who are taken from state and municipal agencies and sent across the globe. Today, it's more likely that they are already in federal law enforcement employment, or some of them are veterans coming out of the military. So they have kind of more specialized training oftentimes. So that dynamic is a little different. Again, it's less about everyday policing. The whole idea that I say over and over and over again in the book, the whole idea is that everyday policing is the way to prevent communist revolution. Because what do you need to make a communist revolution? Well, you need to like smuggle in some propaganda materials. You need to have some kind of other access to resources that will allow you to have a kind of underground infrastructure. So how do you stop somebody from getting access to illicit resources? Well, you pull them over on the side of the road and you search their car, right? It's a very standard policing strategy. I have this photo, it's not in the book, but I have a photo that I found in the archives where, it's like a car pulled over on the side of the street. There's 3 South Vietnamese police officers kind of searching it, in the wheel well, whatever. And then there's one U.S. police advisor standing there kind of watching over it, wearing like a button-down shirt, and he's just kind of observing. And that's basically what this looked like, and that's arguably what U.S. empire looked like. This guy giving technical assistance, training advice to these local officers who are tasked with doing the job. And what does the job look like? Well, it looks very similar to policing within the United States. Of course, there are specialized police units that engage in more kind of secretive activities and surveillance and so forth, and the U.S. equips them to do that. That continues to this day. Training police how to effect traffic stops is not at the top of the list of what the U.S. is trying to do in other countries now.
So you talked a little bit about the connection between development and policing. I'm interested in like this link. Were they ever like sold as one package? So for example, like if you build a dam, you need someone to basically kick the people off the land who are going to be displaced by the structure of that dam. I'm just curious if there was that explicit connection or if it was just implicit or how it worked.
I think it was both explicit and implicit, yeah. And and it also, so you have to kind of like identify a country and look at the country to kind of figure out how it operated. But in Thailand, particularly as the 1960s wear on, where the United States is very worried about the kind of spread of war from South Vietnam across Southeast Asia, they increasingly, every development officer is given a kind of security role. So the United States creates a whole new Thai police agency, and then it has like within it different platoons. One is like the teacher platoon. So it's like, there would be actual teachers in the schools who were development trained officers, but they were police, right? So like these missions really merge together in places where the fears are really strong that there is about to be a revolution, or the insurgencies are going to kind of grow and take hold. But the Office of Public Safety is housed in, as I said, in the Agency for International Development. I mean, it is the development arm of the U.S. government. And what's even more interesting, I think, is that a lot of USAID employees in the 1960s, of course, a lot of them are idealistic kind of liberals. And so you might think they would say like, okay, we're not so comfortable about having these police advisors, you know, working out of our same shop because they're so concerned with the threat of communism. But actually what they would say was like, yeah, we need those guys who are so concerned with the threat of communism. Those officers are doing the really important work. When they start doing this stuff about like teaching them how to direct traffic, well then that doesn't seem actually all that important, which I think is a total reversal of what we would think about how the development professionals approach this. But that's what the archives suggested to me, that kind of reversal. So, and I think again it goes to a kind of broader discussion of like how was development itself. I mean, remember that Walt Rostow's, you know, as one of the kind of key theorists of development, you know, his most famous book it is called A Non-Communist Manifesto, or subtitled A Non-Communist Manifesto. So development is specifically framed as being an antidote to communism. Yeah.
What are you working on next?
No, the ink's barely dry here, man. So I'm
Surely there are ideas.
Yeah, there are ideas. Well, I'm interested in basically what happens after 1975. I'm interested in this kind of profusion of responsibilities for police training and assistance in many other government bureaucracies, and even just like getting a picture of what it looks like is really hard. Again, in you know, from 1962 to 1975, the Foreign Assistance Act, which governs AID, was the sole authorization for it. Now it's under, you know, the authorizing bill that authorizes the defense budget, Homeland Security budget, DOJ's budget, and so on and so on and so on. So even just like, you know, anybody who's tried to read a bill in Congress knows that it's like, makes your eyes spin. So I'm starting to do some of that work, and so I think that might just be a short article, just kind of like laying out the parameters of what it looks like, you know, after 1975 and the present. But I'm also kind of more broadly interested in how U.S. security assistance, which of course is very much in the news now, the whole Ukraine thing is all about security assistance. I'm very much interested in how security assistance itself kind of refashions politics and economics on a global scale. And I kind of have this intuition that comes out of this book that you know, U.S. security, the police assistance was oftentimes aimed at controlling trade unionism in the cities in countries of the third world. Well, they got so good at controlling trade unionism that the left just said, all right, we're going to go fight guerrilla warfare in the countryside because unions are no longer a viable option. And then guerrilla warfare in the countryside becomes less viable, so some of them turn to narcotics. You know, and so there's like there's this kind of dynamic of kind of back and forth between U.S. security objectives, the implements it develops in other countries, and what the objects of those objectives, how they interpret it. So that's like one thing that I might do. I also have a research project that's more specifically about how police in the United States act as political actors. And this again is kind of in a post-1970s period. I mean, I have a bit of it in the book, which is to say that police themselves are become fairly on board with the war on crime. They start out being very skeptical of it, and then eventually they become very favorable to it, in part because it's going to send a lot of resources from Washington to their own pockets. Well, this dynamic only increases from the 70s up to the present, where you find, you know, in the 1980s and 1990s with the crime bills that are passed, the police are the most vocal supporters of them. So I'm trying to, you know, kind of understand how police, what their political activism looks like, where it comes from, and what it achieves. You know, and certainly looking up to kind of the way that police organizations have endorsed Donald Trump. I mean, in the 60s, it was unimaginable for police to endorse a president because police previously had been, you know, in earlier decades, you know, in the progressive era into the early decades of the 20th century, police had been so linked with political party machines at the urban scale that the whole professionalization and reform effort that my book kind of looks at, that tried to sever those links between politics and police. But once it was severed, police became a new type of political actor, where they weren't under the control of politicians, but now, arguably, we could say they control politicians to some degree. So that's one of the other things we're looking at. So those are two big projects that two big books I could write, or I might not write any of them.
In terms of your thesis in the book, what is how, if you want to translate it to the contemporary situation, contemporary analog, what would it be? Do you see like parallels in terms of the way the focus on anti-terrorism, not only externally but internally? So you have sort of situations like in Guantanamo Bay, where the constitutional protections we have for American citizens for like habeas corpus, having an open trial, a very objective judicial process is not applied, and also when you look at the ramping up of border security, do you see analogs there and how?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, yeah. I think that the again, it's just there's so many dimensions to the kind of national security apparatus now, and so many, I think that during the Cold War, national security became a kind of organizing principle and vocabulary and logic for a lot of politics. But it's only grown, and it's only become more outside the realm of political contention. Again, it's like you see this, I don't know, when I was driving here, I was listening to this stupid congressional hearing, and it's just like, what is the premise of this whole hearing? It's like, well, it's totally unacceptable to cut security aid to Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that's the fundamental principle here. And so, the way that becomes sort of outside any kind of political contention whatsoever, I think has its roots in the Cold War and has its roots in the kind of commitment to national security. And it's certainly after 9/11, there certainly is a shift along those lines. And in some ways, the development of the kind of technical law enforcement apparatuses, they're almost trying to catch up to where the kind of political discourse is. The political discourse is in front of them. Whereas I think in the period I look at, they're actually ahead to some degree of the political discourse. But yeah, I think that we could look, certainly the border I think is one of the most important places for us to have our attention focused on thinking about how U.S. power is neither foreign or domestic, but is really operating in both spaces and is abrogating people's constitutional. Certainly the border is a constitution-free zone for everybody. Even for American citizens, but the abrogation of human rights. It's like almost any kind of protection that you might think that liberal ideology offers does not exist on the border, right? So I think that is a place that we should really focus our analytic and political attention. Yeah.
So speaking of borders, I'm thinking about your title and thinking about what I thought was always your title before, right? Was it American Streets, Foreign Territory?
American Streets, Foreign Territory.
And both titles are great, but I'd love to hear you talk about the shift from the dissertation title to the book title. And I'm just thinking about territoriality, and also the way that this title evokes an international working class. Badges. I know it's meant mainly. Well, I don't know. Is it meant mainly as a jokey title, or could we take it seriously as a?
Reveal my thinking.
Is there a sense of a police force that exceeds the Empire State? The U.S. or.
Certainly, yeah. I think that what the actors I look at are trying to do is try to build a global police conglomeration or fraternity, or they'll use words like fraternity. They will say these weird things, again going back to the kind of weird, liberal, almost multiculturalism. They'll say these things. I have these quotes where they're like, No matter where you go around the globe, no matter what color of skin a cop has, a cop is a cop, he's your brother, blah, blah, blah. So it's gendered, but it's also like weird stuff going on with regards to race that I think deserve kind of close attention.
All cops are brothers.
Sorry?
All cops are brothers.
Yeah, exactly. Is that what that means? Yeah, so yeah, I am trying to kind of elucidate that kind of calling into being that they're trying to do of this more than national grouping of police. And it's because they think that the threat is more than national. Black radicalism is international. Communist movement is international. They are trying to create an adequate answer to what they see as an internationalist threat, so they become internationalists themselves. Yeah, the original title when it was a dissertation was American Streets, Foreign Territory. It had too many syllables. That was the main answer. But I don't know. I had some like weird idea about how many syllables are necessary for like SEO or whatever. But but also I didn't want to use the words of my historical actors in my title, I guess. And so American Streets, Foreign Territory is me pulling a quote from Daryl Gates. And so Daryl Gates is the LAPD chief, who I write about at some length in the book, and try to puncture his own self-mythologizing. But part of his self-mythologizing was to say, he said, the streets of America's cities were becoming like a foreign territory. I mean, I want to take that seriously, but he wants to say, I was the first person who ever realized this. And what I'm saying is like, no. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of American police officers already understood that.
So did Bobby Seale.
And so did Bobby Seale and a range of lots of articles. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious in your research if you came across anything on like the export of crowd control equipment, those sorts of things, because of the kind of contemporary implications. Tonight, the Senate also passed restrictions on the export of U.S. crowd control equipment to Hong Kong, which is interesting.
The Senate passed it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
With the scary actor, they're, I guess, more excited about that kind of oversight. So I'd be curious to hear if you came across those sorts of things or what sort of oversight that there might be there.
There was not much oversight, I guess I would say. One of the interesting things that happens is that, the way that development aid works, and of course, conservative critics of development aid to this day don't really get this, but the way development aid works is that the US government gives money to US corporations to give stuff to other countries. It's not that the US, writes a check to country X, writes a check to corporation Y in the, home district of the senator who writes the bill for foreign aid. So when it came to tear gas, two kind of interesting things happened. So on the one hand, a lot of corporations want to get in on this sale of tear gas overseas, arms manufacturers. On the other hand, again, as I said, there's this notion among the police assistance people that they are saving the US government money. So they themselves have technicians and kind of scientists who are trying to develop cheaper tear gas delivery methods. So that's an interesting kind of thing that happens in the period I look at, where the corporations are like, yeah, this is going to be great. This will be a spending bonanza, and we're going to be able to sell so much CS all around the globe. On the other hand, the police advisors themselves are like, well, we can figure out a way to save some money. So I don't know that exact dynamic is present today. As far as oversight goes, I do think that it's necessary but also insufficient. So I think what you've just alerted us to, I think is important. These restrictions on exports, I think those are important. At the same time, that, you know, even if the tear gas doesn't come from U.S. manufacturers, it's going to come from somewhere else. So, you know, I mean, I think also like tear gas, there was a story, I can't remember where it was published, but there was a story, I think they came out over the summer about a factory that makes tear gas. It's in Pennsylvania. Was that?
BuzzFeed published.
BuzzFeed published, yeah. I mean, it was fascinating. It's like these workers work on these absolutely terrible conditions. Basically their whole job, all day, every day, is tear gassing themselves. Like there's no way to, because what tear gas is an extremely fine powder. So even if you wear a respirator, there's no way to keep these particles from kind of getting into your pores and your eyes and whatever. So they are suffering. They're getting paid horrifically low wages. So I don't know. I mean, it's like we need to unionize those workers and get them to go on strike and shut the business down. You know, I mean, it's like these are some of the basically my point is that, you know, oversight at the level of Congress is only getting us so far if we want to sort of interfere with some of these circulations. We need to think perhaps more creatively. I mean, I think a lot of those folks would be happy to not continue to do that work. They would like to have safer, healthier jobs. So maybe we need to talk about jobs guarantee, other ways to kind of make it so that those companies can no longer exist.
So is there ever like a conservative, revanchist, like segregationist attempt to affect this kind of like liberal reformist policing project that you're outlining? Like, so do the Bull Connors of the world essentially only figure in it as like examples of like the out of this fit bad type of policing that these reformers are trying to, prove that the U.S. isn't doing? Or are they actually acting themselves on this program or forming some kind of like alternative institution with like the Casa of Rhodesia or whatever?
Right. That's a really good question. I have not seen a kind of like alternative institution created. That doesn't mean that it wasn't. And I think that there's a book called Revolutionaries for the Right by a guy named Kyle Burke that is a really fantastic book about. It's mostly about right-wing actors who work across borders. And a lot of them have kind of connections with some of these mercenaries who are operating in places like Rhodesia in the 1970s. Whether a figure like Bull Connor or other less well-known figures like him were tapped into those networks, I would assume that they probably were subscribers to the newsletters, but whether they were institution building in the same way, I just haven't seen any evidence of that. At the same time, I don't want to overstate how liberal these police were. I mean, they're liberal, but they're not, they're still pretty conservative. And I think this is also just a problem of our American political vocabulary, where liberal means multiple things. So in the South, there were institutions that were built that were training operations and kind of centers of activity where police from the South were meant to go, again, with the idea that they would learn how to reform, learn how to be less racist. But not every police agency was willing to send their officers to those. So police institutions on a national scale and even regional, there's variation, and I think that's worth paying attention to. So somebody like Herbert Jenkins, I think his name is, I'm not sure if that's right, but I think it's something Jenkins. He's the police chief in Atlanta. So in order to become a cop in Atlanta in the 20s or whenever he became a cop, he had to join the Klan. By the 1960s, he's a racial liberal and he's like more or less anti-segregation as much as you can be when you're still a police chief in a Jim Crow town. So he becomes a kind of ally of Johnson insofar as he is seen as a person who can both speak to the Bull Connors of the world and speak to the Johnson administration. He can be a kind of intermediary working in between the two. And he also is totally on board with the project of training police across the globe. So, yeah, I think it's worthwhile to think of police as not totally a homogeneous organization. There are different kind of political goals and political attitudes and different institutional apparatuses within them. But I think, that's not to say that somebody couldn't find what you're describing. I just didn't see it. Maybe one more question. Yeah.
I'm interested how you see the kind of police training that you trace in the book, where U.S. police are the trainers of the trainers. How you see that compared to, like, in D.C., the last, I want to say 2 or 3 police chiefs have all gone and trained with the IDF, like the Israeli Defense Force. And how you see that, like, where it's, whether it's a symbolic move, whether it is having the chief, or the future chief, the trainer be trained. And so how you see that movement, or how we might, like, through the work that you've done, analyze that or understand that?
Yeah. I think, again, it's something that is different, that just, it's different from what existed during the period I look at. Although there was kind of, like, again, as I mentioned, there was this kind of peer-to-peer kind of cultural fellowship diplomacy where, you would take cops from other countries and bring them to station houses in the U.S. just to kind of, like, get to know each other. So now it's happening in the reverse direction, but I don't know that it's totally clear what it's actually doing. I think you said, like, is it symbolic? Like, I think a lot of it is symbolic. What is it symbolizing? That's not totally transparent. I'm not sure that we are exactly sure, because certainly, like, people on the left are really skeptical of it. So, like, is it just trolling the left? I don't know. Like, sometimes I think, like, most decisions that are being made in the corridors of power these days are just trolling. But the thing that enables this to happen again is that there isn't a kind of centralized, government bureaucracy to have oversight over any of this. And Washington, D.C.'s Metropolitan Police is not funding this. It's being funded by private entities. So that's another kind of piece to the puzzle that didn't exist to a great degree in the period I studied. That there was some foundation funding, and in fact, a lot of the actors I look at, they're like, okay, where can we get more money for policing? We're not getting enough from the government. Can we talk to foundations? And they start talking to the Ford Foundation. So that idea of, like, getting private money is already kind of arising in the 1960s. But now there's lots and lots of deep-pocketed private actors who are funding this type of thing. I think that it's become a target of activism, and I think that that's worthwhile and should be continued. And I think that, like, some of you may know about the story. I think it's in Durham, North Carolina, where the city council passed a bill that said that the police in that city will no longer engage in kind of these training or whatever operations with police of other countries. It doesn't single out Israel. It's about all other countries. I think that kind of legislation is worthwhile. I think it should be. It's like the right through organizations like ALEC. They write cookie cutter legislation that they just, like, ship to every city council, every state house across the country, and then they all get adopted. I think that the left should be doing something similar. But I also am a little bit hesitant to declare 100% that this is like the most nefarious thing that could possibly be happening right now. I mean, I'm just not, I don't think we know enough about it yet. I mean, people have done really phenomenal research, and I've read some pretty suggestive stuff about the negative impacts it has, but I also just don't think that it's the case that, I mean, this was true in the 1960s and it's true today. It's not, you know, you don't need to have a cop from another place tell you that like there's a threat that cops are the ones that are gonna solve. Like a cop, that's just part of their training. It's like, we are here to solve problems, the threats are out there, we're the last thing between, you know, civilization and anarchy, whatever. Like that kind of ideology is present in police training, and it, you know, the DC Metropolitan Police Chief doesn't need to be told that by somebody from any other country to already be familiar with that way of thinking. So I'm critical of that type of action, but I'm not totally sure that it's as decisive as some of the critics will have it be.
On that note, let's give Stuart a round of applause.
So I have a few copies of the book for sale, not very many. If you need it, you can get it from UC Press, and also if you have any trouble finding it, just Google it or just contact me. I'm easy to find online. So thanks so much.
Hey, nice to see you.